Tonight, we're traveling to Victorian London, to a city that is still mostly asleep. The year is somewhere in the 1870s. Outside, the streets are still dark. The gas lamps are burning low along the footpaths, casting a soft yellow light onto the wet cobblestones. Most of the city is asleep. The shopkeepers, the factory workers, the servants in their attic rooms, all of them still in their beds. But in a small sorting office not far from the high street, the work has already begun. The doors are open, gas jets burn along the walls. Men stand at long wooden counters, their breath just visible in the cold morning air. And somewhere in that room, among the stacks of letters and the canvas mailbags, one postman is getting ready for another very long day. His name is Walter. He has done this job for 23 years. He knows every street on his route, every door, every knocker. Tonight, we'll spend some time with him. The streets are quiet. The bag is heavy on his shoulder. The morning is just beginning. Walter woke at 4:30. He had done it for so long that he no longer needed a clock. His body simply knew. The room was cold. A small window above his bed let in a thin strip of gray from the street outside, just enough to see the outline of the chair where he had laid his uniform the night before. He dressed quietly. Trousers first, then his shirt, then the dark wool jacket with the brass buttons down the front. His boots were by the door. He laced them slowly, sitting on the edge of the bed, listening to the silence of the house. His wife was still asleep. The children, too. He tried not to let the floorboards creak as he made his way down the narrow staircase and out into the street. Outside, the air was sharp and damp. London in the early morning had a particular smell. Coal smoke, wet stone, something faintly metallic that Walter had never quite been able to name but had known all his working life. The gas lamps threw small circles of light onto the pavement. Between them, the street was dark. He walked with his hands in his pockets, head down against the cold. He knew this walk so well he could have done it blind. Left out of his front door, down the hill, past the ironmonger, past the church with the cracked step at the bottom of its gate. Right at the corner where the butcher's shop stood, shuttered and dark, the smell of sawdust and old meat still hanging in the air. And then the sorting office. The building was not much to look at. A plain brick frontage on a narrow street, a set of double doors, always left open from 4 o'clock onwards, letting a rectangle of warm yellow light spill out onto the pavement. Walter stepped inside. The room was long and low-ceilinged, lit by gas jets along both walls. Down the center ran a row of tall wooden sorting frames, each one divided into dozens of small slots, each slot labeled with a street name in faded ink. 6 or 7 men stood at the frames, their backs to the door, working through the first delivery of the morning. Letters moved quickly from hand to hand. A glance at the address, a flick of the wrist, the soft sound of paper sliding into a wooden slot. Over and over again. Walter nodded to the man nearest the door, a heavy-set fellow named Tom who had been there longer than anyone. Tom nodded back without looking up. Walter took his place at his section of the frame. His route was always the same: 43 streets, several hundred doors. He had sorted the letters for this patch so many times that his hands moved almost without thinking. He would pick up a letter, read the address, and his arm would already be moving toward the right slot before his mind had fully registered the words. Henrietta Street, slot near the top left. Broad Lane, third row, middle. Cavendish Terrace. Bottom right, just above the crack in the wood that had been there since his first winter on the job. He had asked once if someone was going to fix it. Nobody ever did. Around 5 o'clock, someone brought tea. It arrived in a large brown pot chipped around the spout. Walter poured himself a cup and drank it standing up, strong and dark, with no milk. The tea was hot. That was all that mattered at 5 in the morning. By 5:30, the letters were bundled. Each bundle wrapped in string, ordered by street, slotted into the large canvas bag that Walter would carry on his route. He lifted it onto his shoulder. It was heavy. It was always heavy. He checked the bundle one last time. Everything in order. He pulled on his coat, settled the bag across his shoulder, and walked back out through the double doors and into the dark street. The city was still quiet, but not for much longer. The city woke up in layers. Walter saw all of them. He had been walking these streets before first light for 23 years. And the order of it had become as familiar to him as the layout of his own house. The first layer was the workers, not the factory men, not yet, but the ones whose jobs existed to serve everyone else before everyone else was awake. The milkmen with their carts, the horses moving slowly, the glass bottles chinking softly against each other. The baker already at his door, the smell of bread drifting out into the cold morning air. Walter nodded to these people as he passed. They nodded back. They were all part of the same early London, the one that existed before the city officially began. His first street was a short road of terraced houses, 3 stories each. Pale brick, slightly blackened by coal smoke. Iron railings along the front, most of them painted black, some going rusty at the base. Walter went to the first door. He found the letterbox, a horizontal slot fitted with a small brass flap. He folded the letter once, pushed it through. The flap swung back with a soft click. He was already moving to the next house before the sound had finished. This was the rhythm of the job. No pausing, no lingering. Click. Next door, click. Next door. Some letterboxes were easier than others. The newer ones on the more prosperous streets were wide enough to accept most letters without folding. The older ones were more difficult. One house on Cavendish Terrace had a letterbox with a spring so stiff that pushing a letter through it required genuine effort. Walter had never understood why the household had not had it replaced. He had been fighting that spring for 11 years. The baker's shop was always the first sign that the street was coming alive. The door propped open despite the cold, a thick warmth rolling out along with the smell of bread already in the oven. The baker himself, a broad man with flour on his apron, would glance up as Walter passed. No letter this morning. The baker went back to his work. By the time he reached the far end of his first round, the city had fully woken. The quiet of the early morning had given way to something fuller. Voices, cartwheels on cobblestones, children somewhere, already out and moving. Walter shifted the bag on his shoulder. It was lighter now. Not light, but lighter. He turned and started back toward the sorting office. There was a second bundle waiting. There was always a second bundle. He had walked this route enough times that the streets had become part of him. There was a particular kind of knowledge that came only from repetition, not from studying a map, but from walking the same streets, in the same order, at the same hour, for years on end. Walter had that kind of knowledge. He carried it in his feet as much as in his head. He knew that the third paving stone outside number 14 on Henrietta Street had a slight lip on its left edge. Not enough to trip on if you knew it was there. He had caught his own boot on it in the early years. He did not anymore. He simply stepped around it without thinking, the way a person steps around a piece of furniture in a room they have lived in for a long time. He knew which stretch of pavement on Broad Lane became slick in wet weather because the drain pipe above it had been blocked for as long as he could remember. He knew where the dog lived, behind the door of a narrow house on Cavendish Terrace, the one that threw itself against the wood every single morning without fail, as if each delivery were the first it had ever encountered. These things were not written down anywhere. They existed only in the body of a man who had walked the same ground. Enough times that the ground had become part of him. Some of the houses he had been delivering to for so long that he had watched them change without ever setting foot inside. Number 22 on Cavendish Terrace had been occupied by the same household for as long as Walter could remember. He knew this because the name on the letters had never changed. A woman's name. Written in various different hands over the years, addressed to her by family, by friends, by what appeared to be a correspondence that had been going on for decades. He had never seen her. In 23 years, the door of number 22 had never opened while he was on the step. He pushed the letters through the slot and heard them fall onto whatever surface lay on the other side. And that was all. But she was, in some way he could not quite explain, one of the most familiar people on his route. He knew the rhythm of her correspondence. He knew that she received more letters in winter than in summer. He knew that every year, around the middle of December, a particularly thick envelope arrived, always posted from the same town in the north of England. He did not know what was inside it. He never would. The houses slid past. The letters went through the slots. The bag grew lighter by degrees. The morning moved forward in the way that mornings did on this route, steadily, without drama, one door at a time. Walter never read the letters. In his early years on the job, there had been a moment, occasionally, when a letter passed through his hands and he was aware of a kind of curiosity. Not a desire to open anything, just a brief flicker of wondering. What is this? Who sent it? What does it say? After a few years, even that had faded. The letters had become, in one sense, simply objects. And yet, the envelopes told their own story if you knew how to look. The paper was the first thing. Thick cream-colored paper with a slight texture meant money, or at least the appearance of it. Thin gray paper meant something more ordinary. Not worse, necessarily, just different. The family letters were the ones he noticed most. He could usually tell them by the handwriting on the outside. The hand of a person writing to someone they knew well, without having to think too carefully about the impression they were making. Some had postmarks from other parts of London, some from the countryside, some from further afield. Ireland, Scotland, sometimes somewhere further still, a colony, a garrison town, a port city on the other side of the world. Walter thought about those ones sometimes. The distance a letter had traveled to end up in his bag, the weeks it had spent at sea, in a mail bag in the hold of a ship, moving through weather he would never see, and then arriving eventually on a quiet residential street in London, pushed through a slot in a door by a man in a dark wool jacket with brass buttons. There was one kind of letter he had never been able to approach entirely without feeling. The letters that arrived at an address where, shortly before, someone had died. The letter would come addressed in the usual way to a name Walter knew from years of delivery, and he would push it through the slot knowing from some change in the household he had registered without being told that the person it was addressed to was no longer there to read it. A black wreath on the door, perhaps, or simply the absence of the small signs of life he had learned to read without thinking. The curtains drawn for too many days in a row, the step not cleaned. He could not return the letter. He could only deliver it, and whoever opened it on the other side would have the task of reading words written for someone who was gone. He thought about this sometimes briefly as the letter went through the slot. Then he moved on to the next house. There was always a next house. London had a relationship with the weather that went beyond the ordinary inconvenience of it. The coal fires, hundreds of thousands of them burning through the autumn and winter months, sent a continuous slow exhalation of smoke up into the air above the rooftops. It mixed with the moisture that came in off the river and up from the damp streets. And what came down was not quite rain and not quite smoke, but something in between that coated everything it touched with a faint gray film and got into the back of the throat and stayed there. The fog was the worst. On a bad fog morning, Walter could see perhaps 10 feet ahead of him, sometimes less. The gas lamps became vague orange smears in the gray, present but useless. The sounds of the street changed on fog mornings. Hooves on cobblestone sounded closer than they were, or further. It was difficult to tell which. Voices floated past without a visible source. Walter had learned to navigate by feel on the worst days. He knew how many steps it was from the corner of Henrietta Street to the first door. He knew the feel of the different iron railings under his hand as he moved along a terrace. The smooth ones, the ones with a rough patch halfway along where someone had repaired a break years ago. These things guided him on the mornings when his eyes were of limited use. Rain was more straightforward. Rain was simply wet. His boots let in water at the left toe. He had had them repaired twice. But there was something about the way the leather had worn that meant water always found its way in at that particular spot. On a long wet morning, he was aware of the coldness of it from about the 3rd Street onward. By the end of the route, it was simply something he had stopped registering. There was one kind of morning that Walter privately considered the best of the year, just a particular combination of conditions that appeared occasionally in the early autumn. Cool air, but not cold. A clear sky just beginning to lighten in the east, the stars still faintly visible overhead. No wind, the streets quiet and dry, the gas lamps burning steadily in the still air, his coat comfortable, his boots dry, the bag sitting well on his shoulder. On those mornings, the route felt like something close to a pleasure. Not a holiday, not an occasion, just a walk through a quiet city with letters to deliver, which was, he supposed, exactly what it was. Walter always ate before he left the house. Bread, most mornings, a thick slice, sometimes two. Butter when they had it. On better weeks, a rasher of bacon fried quickly in the pan while he dressed, the smell of it reaching him upstairs. Tea, always, strong and dark, in the same chipped mug he had used for as long as he could remember. He drank it standing up at the kitchen table. The midday break came roughly halfway through the working day. The supervisor allowed half an hour. Some of the men went to a small eating house 2 streets away that everyone called Doris's, a low-ceilinged place with wooden tables and simple food served without much ceremony. Walter went there on Tuesdays and Fridays. On the other days, he brought something from home. The back room of the sorting office had a small fireplace. In winter, it was kept going through the working day. Walter would come in from the route, set the empty bag on the table, and stand close to the fire for a few minutes before sitting down. Not long, just enough. The warmth reached into the hands and the shoulders and the particular part of the lower back that ached after a long, wet morning, and for a few minutes, everything was simply warm. Walter's particular comfort, the one he thought about on the harder mornings, was simple. A mug of tea, the fire, his boots off, 5 minutes of sitting without moving. He did not require a great deal. He had never required a great deal. But those 5 minutes, in the middle of a long working day, with the warmth from the fireplace and the weight off his feet, were as close to contentment as he felt any regular need to get. He finished his bread. He drank the last of the tea. He put his boots back on, laced them up, stood. The second round was waiting. It always was. In Walter's first year on the job, there was a field at the far end of Cavendish Terrace. Not a large field, just a rectangle of rough grass behind a low wooden fence. Sometimes a few children played in it. Sometimes it was empty for weeks at a time. Then one autumn, the fence came down. The ground was broken and the foundations went in and the brickwork began to rise. By the following spring, the field was gone. In its place stood 4 terraced houses, identical to the ones beside them, as if they had always been there. Walter added the new addresses to his route. He delivered to them for the next 20 years. But he remembered the field. This was the thing about walking the same streets for a long time. You became a kind of record of them. Not a written record, just a human one. A man who remembered what had been in a particular place before what was there now. The people changed too. There were households on his route that had been there for the entire span of his career. The same family name on the letters for 23 years. But a family name is not the same as the same people. Children grew up. He watched this happen at a particular kind of distance, the distance of a man who sees the same door every morning but never goes through it. There was a woman on Cavendish Terrace who had kept a small garden at the front of her house. A few rose bushes, kept carefully. Some smaller plants that Walter had never known the names of, flowering at different times of year. In summer, the front of her house smelled different from the houses on either side. He had delivered to her door thousands of times. She had occasionally been in the garden when he arrived and had nodded to him, and he had nodded back. That had been the extent of their acquaintance. Then one spring the garden was not tended. The following summer it had gone to weed. By the autumn a new family had moved in and had the whole thing paved over. Walter delivered their letters as he had delivered hers. But he noticed, for some time afterward, the absence of the smell in summer. He was not the same man who had started this job. His hair had gone gray in his late 30s and stayed there. The shoulder where the bag strap sat was permanently slightly lower than the other one, a thing his wife had pointed out and which he had not noticed himself until she did. He had walked these streets as a young man, full of the particular energy of someone who does not yet know how long things take. He walked them now as someone who knew precisely. The city changed. The streets changed. The people in the houses changed. Walter walked through all of it, year after year, with his bag on his shoulder and his letters to deliver. The city changed around him. He simply kept walking. The afternoon round was quieter than the morning. The urgency had gone out of the streets. People moved with the particular gait of those who have done most of what they needed to do and are making their way toward the remainder of the day. Walter moved through them steadily. The same streets, the same doors, but the light was different now, coming from a lower angle, catching the upper stories of the buildings and leaving the street level in an early shadow. He started, as always, at the top of Henrietta Street. The bag was full again. The shoulder accepted it without complaint. The letter went through the first door. The flap swung back. He was already moving. The bag grew lighter as the afternoon went on, street by street, door by door. He turned onto Cavendish Terrace. The stiff letterbox was halfway along, the one he had been fighting since his early years on the route. One letter. He folded it once, pushed it through with the same firm pressure he had used 10,000 times before. The spring resisted. The letter went through. The flap closed. He allowed himself, as he sometimes did at this particular door, a very small feeling of satisfaction. Not triumph, just the quiet acknowledgement of a small recurring difficulty routinely overcome. Number 22 was near the end of the terrace. There was a letter today. There was not always one. He folded it and pushed it through the slot and listened to the soft sound of it landing. He stood for a moment on the step. The afternoon round was quieter than the morning. The urgency had gone out of the streets. People moved with the particular gait of those who have done most of what they needed to do and are making their way toward the remainder of the day. Walter moved through them steadily. The same streets, the same doors, but the light was different now, coming from a lower angle, catching the upper stories of the buildings and leaving the street level in an early shadow. He started, as always, at the top of Henrietta Street. The bag was full again. The shoulder accepted it without complaint. The letter went through the first door. The flap swung back. He was already moving. The bag grew lighter as the afternoon went on, street by street, door by door. He turned onto Cavendish Terrace. The stiff letterbox was halfway along, the one he had been fighting since his early years on the route. One letter. He folded it once, pushed it through with the same firm pressure he had used 10,000 times before. The spring resisted. The letter went through. The flap closed. He allowed himself, as he sometimes did at this particular door, a very small feeling of satisfaction. Not triumph, just the quiet acknowledgement of a small recurring difficulty routinely overcome. Number 22 was near the end of the terrace. There was a letter today. There was not always one. He folded it and pushed it through the slot and listened to the soft sound of it landing. He stood for a moment on the step. The evening was still and the street was quiet, and for a brief moment, he simply stood. Then he adjusted the bag on his shoulder and walked to the end of the terrace and turned the corner. The last street was Marlborough Place. He had 2 letters left. He delivered the first. The last letter was for the house at the end of the row. He went to the door, found the letter box, pushed the letter through. The flap swung back. He listened to the silence after it. Then he turned and came back out onto the pavement. The bag was empty. He stood for a moment outside the last house on the last street of the route. The street was quiet around him. A cat crossed the pavement at the far end and disappeared between 2 railings. Somewhere behind him, the gas lamps were beginning to come on. He could not see them from here, but he knew it. The lamplighter was working his way along. The city was settling into the evening. He walked back to the sorting office, returned the empty bag to its hook, said goodnight to Tom, who was still at the frame working through the evening sort. Tom nodded without looking up. Walter put on his coat and walked out through the double doors, left out of the sorting office, down the hill, past the ironmonger, shuttered now, past the church with the cracked step, right at the corner where the butcher's shop stood dark and closed. The same way he had come, the same way he always came. His house was at the end of a short terrace, a light in the front window. His wife moving behind the glass, briefly visible. The smell of something cooking reached him before he had the key in the door. He opened the door. The warmth of the house came out to meet him. He took off his coat, set his boots on the mat, walked in his socked feet down the short hallway and into the kitchen, where the fire was going, and the lamp was lit, and the table was set for the evening meal. His wife looked up. He sat down in his chair. Tomorrow morning at 4:30, he would wake without needing a clock. He would dress in the cold and walk to the sorting office and take his place at the frame. The letters would be there. The route would be there. The doors would be there, all of them, in their correct order, waiting. The canvas bag would be heavy on his shoulder at the start of the morning and light at the end of it. The city would be quiet when he set out and awake by the time he returned. The gas lamps would burn, and Walter would walk through all of it, as he had walked through it yesterday, and the day before, and every day of the working life he had built. One street at a time, one letter at a time, on the same roads, under the same London sky. The fire crackled in the grate. Somewhere outside, a cart moved slowly down the street. The sound of it faded. The house was quiet. The day was done.